"Don't say anything." The desperate whisper cut through the humid Tennessee evening air like a knife, trembling with fear and desperation. The words echoed from the partially open window of the massive Georgian mansion, carried by the warm breeze that rustled through the ancient oak trees lining Belmont Boulevard. Inside, shadows moved frantically across expensive wallpaper, and the sound of hurried footsteps on marble floors created an unsettling rhythm. The golden glow from crystal chandeliers spilled onto the manicured lawn where someone stood frozen, clutching a crumpled piece of paper that would change everything. Time seemed suspended in that moment, as if the universe itself was holding its breath, waiting for the next move in a game that had already claimed too many innocent lives. The sweet scent of magnolia blossoms mixed with something else, something that spoke of secrets buried deep and truths too dangerous to speak aloud. In the distance, a mockingbird's song provided an eerily cheerful soundtrack to what would become the most important night of two very different lives. The mansion's imposing columns stood like silent sentinels, witnesses to a conversation that should never have happened, yet somehow felt inevitable. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where keeping quiet could destroy someone innocent, but speaking up could cost you everything? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and if you've ever faced an impossible choice like this one. Your story might inspire someone else who's struggling with their own moral dilemma right now. Marcus Thompson had never imagined that his evening jog through Nashville's most exclusive neighborhood would lead to this moment. At 34, he carried the weight of single parenthood on his broad shoulders, his carpenter's hands showing the honest calluses of a man who built things from scratch and never asked for handouts. His weathered Ford pickup truck was parked 3 blocks away, a stark contrast to the gleaming Mercedes and BMWs that lined these pristine streets like expensive jewelry in a display case. Marcus had taken this route for months, not because he belonged here, but because the tree-lined sidewalks were safe and well lit, perfect for his nightly runs after tucking his 8-year-old daughter Emma into bed. The irony wasn't lost on him. A blue-collar worker from East Nashville, finding solace in the neighborhood where the city's elite lived behind iron gates and security systems. His running shoes, worn thin from countless miles, had carried him past these mansions so many times that he'd begun to feel invisible, just another ghost moving through their perfect world. Tonight, however, invisibility had become his curse, placing him exactly where he shouldn't be, hearing words that would haunt him forever. The voice that had whispered those desperate words belonged to Rebecca Whitmore, wife of tech mogul Harrison Whitmore III, whose face graced the covers of business magazines and whose company had revolutionized data security for half of America's major corporations. Marcus had seen her picture in the society pages of the Tennessean, always smiling at charity galas and fundraising events, her blonde hair perfectly styled and her blue eyes sparkling with the confidence that came from never having to worry about rent money or grocery bills. But the woman he'd glimpsed through that window bore no resemblance to those glossy photographs. Her hair was disheveled, her expensive silk blouse torn at the shoulder, and her face was etched with the kind of terror that money couldn't buy its way out of. She was speaking to someone Marcus couldn't see, someone whose presence seemed to shrink her into herself, making her appear fragile and breakable despite the fortune that should have been her shield. The contrast between the public Rebecca and this frightened woman was so stark, it made Marcus's chest tighten with recognition. He'd seen that same trapped look in his ex-wife's eyes during their final months together, when love had curdled into something dark and controlling. Marcus pressed himself against the rough bark of an oak tree, his heart hammering against his ribs as he tried to process what he was witnessing. The paper in his hand, a flyer that had blown against his leg during his run, now felt like evidence of his presence, proof that he didn't belong in this moment that felt both private and dangerous. Through the window, he could see expensive artwork on the walls, the kind of original pieces that cost more than his annual salary, and furniture that belonged in museum galleries rather than living rooms, but all that wealth seemed meaningless now, overshadowed by the palpable fear that radiated from the woman inside, like heat waves from summer asphalt. Marcus had grown up poor in rural Kentucky, raised by his grandmother after his parents died in a car accident when he was 12, and he'd learned early that real danger didn't always come from the streets. Sometimes it lived in the most beautiful houses, wore the most expensive clothes, and spoke with the most refined accents. The tremor in Rebecca Whitmore's voice told him everything he needed to know about what kind of danger she was facing, even if he couldn't yet see its source. The sound of approaching footsteps on the mansion's marble floors made Marcus freeze completely, his breath catching in his throat as he realized how exposed he was standing there. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to disappear back into the anonymity of his working-class neighborhood, where problems were straightforward and solutions didn't require navigating the complex moral landscapes of the wealthy and powerful. But something kept his feet planted on that manicured grass. Maybe it was the memory of his own helplessness when his marriage had turned toxic, or perhaps it was the thought of his daughter Emma, asleep in their small apartment, trusting that her father would always choose what was right over what was easy. The approaching footsteps belonged to someone walking with authority, someone accustomed to being obeyed without question, and Marcus found himself holding his breath as shadows moved behind the gauzy curtains. He thought about his grandmother's weathered hands teaching him to pray, about the small Baptist church where she'd raised him to believe that witnessing evil and doing nothing was its own kind of sin. The moral weight of that lesson pressed down on him now, heavier than any lumber he'd ever carried on a construction site. Inside the mansion, a man's voice joined the conversation, smooth and cultured but carrying an undercurrent of menace that made Marcus's skin crawl. He couldn't make out the words clearly, but the tone was unmistakably threatening, the kind of voice that was used to getting its way through intimidation rather than persuasion. Rebecca's responses came in frightened whispers, her voice breaking with emotion as she seemed to plead for something, mercy, time, understanding, from someone who clearly had no intention of granting any of it. Marcus had heard that same dynamic play out in his own home during the final months with Sarah, when her drinking had turned mean and his attempts at intervention had been met with increasingly creative forms of cruelty. The difference was that Sarah's threats had been fueled by alcohol and desperation, while this man's voice carried the cold calculation of someone who had never known consequences for his actions. The realization that he was witnessing something potentially criminal sent ice water through Marcus's veins, even as the Tennessee humidity made sweat bead on his forehead. The conversation inside grew more heated, and through the window, Marcus caught glimpses of movement that suggested a struggle, not physical, but the kind of psychological warfare that left victims feeling trapped and powerless. His carpenter's eyes, trained to notice structural weaknesses and potential hazards, began cataloging details almost automatically. The window's height from the ground, the distance to his truck, the layout of the surrounding streets that would provide the quickest escape route if needed. But even as his practical mind planned for self-preservation, his conscience wrestled with a more complex question. What obligation did a stranger have to intervene in the private affairs of people whose world he could never fully understand? The paper in his hand crinkled slightly as his grip tightened, and he realized it was a missing person flyer for a young woman named Jessica Chen, a graduate student who had disappeared 3 weeks ago after working late at a research facility owned by Whitmore Industries. The coincidence felt too significant to ignore, like pieces of a puzzle beginning to form a picture he wasn't sure he wanted to see. Marcus thought about Emma, probably dreaming in her small bedroom decorated with drawings she'd made of their little family, stick figures holding hands under a crayon sun, a vision of simple happiness that required nothing more than love and presence to sustain. He thought about the promises he'd made to his daughter, about always being honest, about standing up for people who couldn't protect themselves, about being the kind of man she could be proud of when she grew up and looked back on these formative years. Those promises had seemed easier to keep when the moral choices were clearer, when right and wrong didn't come wrapped in layers of wealth and power that could destroy a working man's life with a single phone call. But as Rebecca Whitmore's voice rose in what sounded like desperation, Marcus realized that some moments don't allow for the luxury of easy choices. They demand that ordinary people find extraordinary courage, regardless of the personal cost. His grandmother's voice echoed in his memory, reminding him that character wasn't measured by what you did when people were watching, but by what you did when you thought no one would ever know. The man's voice inside the mansion grew sharper, more commanding, and Rebecca's responses became increasingly frantic, her words tumbling over each other in a rush to explain or justify something that clearly wasn't being accepted. Marcus found himself leaning closer to the window, straining to catch more of the conversation while simultaneously terrified of what he might learn. The missing person flyer in his hand seemed to pulse with significance. Jessica Chen's smiling face, staring up at him from the crumpled paper, her whole life reduced to physical statistics and a phone number for tips. At 23, she'd been pursuing a master's degree in environmental science, working part-time at one of Whitmore's research facilities to pay for her education, according to the brief description on the flyer. She had parents who were desperately searching for answers, friends who refused to believe she'd simply vanished without a trace, and dreams that had been interrupted by whatever had happened during those late-night hours at the lab. The coincidence of finding this flyer tonight, on this street, while witnessing this conversation, felt like the universe demanding that he pay attention to connections he might otherwise have missed. As the voices inside continued their tense exchange, Marcus began to understand that he was witnessing something far more significant than a domestic dispute between wealthy spouses. The fear in Rebecca's voice suggested that she knew something dangerous, something that powerful people would go to great lengths to keep hidden, and the man's increasingly threatening tone implied that her knowledge made her a liability rather than a partner. Marcus's construction experience had taught him to recognize when a foundation was cracking, when the signs of structural failure were appearing long before the final collapse, and every instinct told him that whatever was happening inside this mansion was building towards something catastrophic. The weight of that realization settled on his shoulders like a physical burden, forcing him to confront the possibility that his evening jog had transformed him from an observer into a witness, with all the responsibilities and dangers that role entailed. He thought about his daughter's future, about the world she would inherit, and whether his actions tonight would make it safer or more dangerous for her to grow up believing in justice and truth. The conversation inside reached what sounded like a crescendo, with Rebecca's voice breaking completely as she seemed to beg for something that was clearly being denied. Through the window, Marcus saw movement that suggested someone was leaving the room, footsteps echoing on marble as they moved toward what must be the mansion's front entrance. The realization that someone might be coming outside sent panic shooting through his system, and he pressed himself harder against the oak tree, praying that its massive trunk would provide enough concealment in the gathering darkness. His mind raced through options: run now and hope he could disappear before being seen, or stay and risk being discovered, but potentially learn more about what was happening to Rebecca Whitmore and how it might connect to Jessica Chen's disappearance. The decision felt monumental, the kind of crossroads moment that would define not just his immediate future, but the kind of man he would be for the rest of his life. In that suspended moment between choices, Marcus heard his grandmother's voice one more time, reminding him that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was doing what needed to be done despite being terrified of the consequences. The front door of the mansion opened with a soft click that somehow carried clearly through the humid evening air, and Marcus felt his entire body tense as footsteps began moving across the front porch. Through his position behind the oak tree, he could see a figure silhouetted against the light from inside, tall, well-dressed, moving with the confident stride of someone accustomed to command. The figure paused on the steps, and Marcus caught his breath, certain he was about to be discovered, but the man seemed to be scanning the street rather than the lawn where Marcus hid. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only seconds, the figure moved toward a black sedan parked in the circular driveway, its expensive lines gleaming under the streetlights like something from a movie about corporate espionage. As the car's engine purred to life with the quiet efficiency of German engineering, Marcus found himself memorizing the license plate number without conscious thought, his mind automatically cataloging details that might prove important later. The sedan pulled away smoothly, its taillights disappearing around the curve of Belmont Boulevard, leaving behind only the scent of exhaust and the oppressive silence of secrets too dangerous to speak aloud. In the aftermath of the departure, the mansion seemed to exhale, its windows glowing more softly now that the tension inside had partially dissipated. But Marcus could still see Rebecca Whitmore's silhouette moving through the rooms, her posture suggesting someone who was far from relieved despite being alone again. The missing person flyer in his hand seemed to grow heavier with each passing moment, Jessica Chen's face a silent accusation that demanded answers he wasn't qualified to provide. As he finally began to move away from his hiding spot, Marcus realized that his simple evening jog had evolved into something that would require decisions far beyond his experience or comfort level. The weight of what he'd witnessed pressed down on him like Tennessee humidity, inescapable and oppressive, as he started the long walk back to his truck and the even longer journey toward understanding what moral obligations came with accidentally stumbling into someone else's nightmare. Behind him, The mansion's lights continued to glow like a beautiful trap, holding secrets that were worth killing for and perhaps already had claimed at least one life. Emma would be asleep by the time he got home, her small body curled around the stuffed elephant he'd bought her for her last birthday, trusting completely in her father's ability to keep her safe in a world that suddenly seemed much more dangerous and complex than it had that morning. Marcus knew that sleep would be elusive for him tonight, haunted by Rebecca Whitmore's terrified whispers and the growing certainty that Jessica Chen's disappearance was connected to whatever was happening behind the walls of that perfect mansion. The missing person flyer crinkled one final time as he carefully folded it and placed it in his pocket, a tangible reminder that some secrets demanded to be exposed, regardless of the personal cost to those brave enough or foolish enough to drag them into the light. As he walked through the darkness toward his truck, Marcus Thompson began to understand that his life had just taken a turn that would test everything he believed about right and wrong, courage and cowardice, and the price of standing up for truth in a world where power and money usually wrote the final chapter. The sound of his footsteps on the sidewalk seemed unusually loud in the quiet neighborhood, each step carrying him further away from the mansion, but deeper into a moral labyrinth that would demand navigation skills he'd never needed as a carpenter building simple, honest structures from wood and nails. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, difficult decisions, and the beginning of a journey that would test whether an ordinary single father from East Nashville had the courage to challenge a system designed to protect people like Harrison Whitmore III while sacrificing people like Jessica Chen. As the mansion's lights faded behind him, Marcus realized that some distances couldn't be measured in city blocks. They could only be measured in the space between knowing something was wrong and finding the strength to do something about it, regardless of how small and powerless you felt in the face of wealth and influence that could reshape reality with a single phone call. The drive home felt like navigating through quicksand, every familiar street seeming foreign and threatening under the weight of what Marcus had witnessed. His hands gripped the steering wheel of his weathered Ford pickup with white-knuckled intensity, the missing person flyer burning like a hot coal in his shirt pocket, where he'd carefully placed it next to his heart. The radio played softly, some late-night country station that usually provided comfort during his solitary drives through Nashville's sleeping neighborhoods. But tonight, the music felt like static, meaningless noise that couldn't penetrate the churning chaos in his mind. Traffic lights blinked yellow in the empty intersections, casting amber shadows that reminded him too much of the golden glow spilling from the Whitmore mansion's windows, and he found himself checking his rearview mirror compulsively, half expecting to see a black sedan following him home. The familiar landmarks of his route, the 24-hour diner where he sometimes took Emma for weekend pancakes, the auto repair shop where he'd learned to fix his truck out of necessity, seemed to mock him with their ordinary simplicity, relics from a life that had been irrevocably complicated by a single overheard conversation. His apartment complex came into view like a sanctuary, its modest brick buildings and patchy parking lot a stark contrast to the manicured perfection of Belmont Boulevard, yet somehow more honest in their worn authenticity. Marcus climbed the stairs to his second-floor unit with leaden feet, each step echoing in the quiet hallway, where the scent of fried chicken and laundry detergent spoke of working families just trying to get by without asking too many questions about the world's darker corners. His key turned in the lock with a familiar click that usually signaled the end of another day's honest labor, but tonight it felt like crossing a threshold into a life that would never be the same again. The apartment greeted him with the comfortable chaos of single parenthood. Emma's art supplies scattered across the coffee table, her school backpack dropped carelessly by the door, a half-completed jigsaw puzzle of horses spread across the kitchen floor where they'd worked on it together after dinner. These simple artifacts of their shared life should have grounded him, reminded him of what truly mattered, but instead they only amplified his growing sense that he was about to drag dangerous complications into the one perfect thing left in his world, his daughter's innocent trust in her father's ability to keep their small universe safe and predictable. The silence in Emma's bedroom was profound, broken only by the soft whisper of her breathing and the occasional rustle as she shifted in her sleep, clutching the worn, stuffed elephant that had been her constant companion since her 3rd birthday. Marcus stood in her doorway, drinking in the sight of her peaceful face illuminated by the nightlight they'd chosen together at the dollar store, a plastic moon that cast gentle silver patterns on the walls she'd decorated with her own drawings of their family. At 8 years old, She still believed that problems could be solved with band-aids and bedtime stories, that good people always won in the end, and that her daddy could fix anything that was broken in their world. The innocence radiating from her sleeping form felt like both a blessing and a burden, a reminder of everything he had to protect and everything he risked losing if he made the wrong choice about what he'd witnessed tonight. Her breathing was steady and deep, the rhythm of absolute security, and Marcus found himself memorizing the sound as if it might be the last time he heard it, without the shadow of fear darkening their small sanctuary. The elephant's button eyes seemed to watch him from the pillow, a silent sentinel guarding dreams that didn't yet know how complicated the adult world could become. Leaving her doorway felt like abandoning a sacred space, but the living room offered no refuge from the storm brewing in his consciousness. Marcus sank into the threadbare couch they'd bought second-hand when he first moved out, its familiar creaks and worn cushions usually a source of comfort after long days swinging hammers and measuring lumber for other people's dreams. Tonight, however, the apartment's modest furnishings felt like props in a play he no longer understood, each object suddenly fragile and temporary in the face of forces that could sweep away everything he'd built from nothing. The missing person flyer lay on the coffee table, where he'd placed it next to Emma's coloring books. Jessica Chen's smiling face, a stark reminder that some people's daughters didn't get to come home safely to their beds. Some fathers didn't get the luxury of worrying about whether to get involved. They were already drowning in the consequences of someone else's evil choices. The contrast between Emma's colorful drawings of stick-figure families holding hands and Jessica's formal college photograph created a juxtaposition that made Marcus's chest ache with the weight of unspoken responsibilities. He thought about Jessica's parents somewhere in the city, probably lying awake wondering if their daughter was suffering, if she was even still alive, if the police were doing enough to bring her home. The memories came flooding back without invitation, 26 years of life experiences suddenly reshuffling themselves to find patterns and connections he'd never wanted to acknowledge. Marcus was 7 years old again, hiding in his grandmother's pantry, while his parents screamed at each other in the kitchen, their voices growing more vicious with each exchange until the sound of shattering glass announced that words had escalated to violence. He could still smell the cinnamon and flour dust on his grandmother's apron as she found him there hours later, her weathered hands gentle as she coaxed him out with promises of hot chocolate and bedtime stories that would chase away the monsters his parents had created in their modest Kentucky farmhouse. The night his parents died, she'd held him while he cried, her voice steady as she promised that sometimes God called good people home early to spare them from becoming something they weren't meant to be, that love could survive even the worst kinds of loss if you were brave enough to keep believing in its power. Those lessons had shaped him into a man who fixed things rather than breaking them, who built instead of tearing down, but they'd also left him with an almost pathological need to protect innocence wherever he found it, even when protection required risking everything he'd worked to create. His marriage to Sarah had started with the kind of hope that only comes from believing you can rewrite your family's story, that love could overcome any obstacle if both people were willing to work hard enough at happiness. She'd been a nurse at the free clinic where he'd taken his grandmother during her final illness, her competence and compassion drawing him like a moth to flame during those dark months when death was winning the battle for the only parent he'd ever really known. Their wedding had been small and simple, held in the same Baptist church where his grandmother had taught Sunday school for 40 years, and for the first few years it seemed like they were building something beautiful together, a foundation strong enough to support the family they both desperately wanted to create. Emma's birth had felt like a miracle, the culmination of dreams neither of them had dared to voice during their own difficult childhoods, and for 18 months Marcus had believed that they'd broken the cycle of dysfunction that had plagued both their families for generations. The nursery he'd built with his own hands, each board measured and cut with the precision of a prayer, had been his masterpiece, not just carpentry, but hope made manifest in pine and paint. But fairy tales don't survive contact with real life, and Sarah's drinking had started as a way to cope with the stress of new motherhood, then evolved into something darker and more consuming with each passing month. Marcus had tried everything, reasoning, pleading, threatening, bargaining, but alcoholism didn't respond to the same logical problem-solving approaches that worked with construction projects, where every challenge had a measurable solution and every mistake could be fixed with the right tools and enough determination. The woman who had once saved lives with steady hands and clear thinking became someone who couldn't be trusted to drive Emma to daycare without stopping at a bar first, who disappeared for days at a time and came home with stories that grew more elaborate and less believable with each iteration. The final straw had come on a Tuesday morning when he'd found Emma, then 6 years old, trying to wake her mother who had passed out on the bathroom floor while a pot of oatmeal burned on the stove, smoke filling their home with the acrid scent of another near disaster. The image of his daughter's frightened face peering around the doorway, asking if Mommy was sick again, had crystallized his understanding that some fights couldn't be won through persistence and good intentions. Sometimes love meant knowing when to walk away before the person you were trying to save destroyed everyone who cared about them. The divorce had been mercifully quick, Sarah's shame at her own behavior, making her willing to sign papers that gave Marcus full custody in exchange for her freedom to pursue the bottom of whatever bottle called to her that week. He'd tried to explain to Emma why Mommy wouldn't be living with them anymore, searching for words that could convey the complexity of addiction without destroying a 6-year-old's faith in the fundamental goodness of the people who were supposed to protect her. The conversations had taken place in the same living room, where Marcus now sat contemplating another impossible situation. Emma curled in his lap, while he tried to balance honesty with hope, truth with the kind of gentle protection that children deserved from the adults in their lives. She'd asked if Mommy would get better, if she would come home when she wasn't sick anymore, and Marcus had given her the only answer he could live with, that sometimes grown-ups made choices that hurt everyone, including themselves, but that didn't mean they stopped being loved or that their families stopped hoping for better days ahead. The promise he'd made that night, that he would never leave her, never choose anything over her safety and happiness, had become the organizing principle of every decision he'd made for the past 2 years. Now staring at Jessica Chen's photograph, while Emma slept peacefully in the next room, Marcus felt the weight of those promises colliding with a new kind of moral obligation that threatened to upset the careful balance he'd constructed from the wreckage of his marriage. Every parenting decision had been filtered through the lens of stability and predictability, choosing jobs that offered regular hours over higher pay, living in neighborhoods where Emma could walk to school safely, building a social circle of other single parents who understood that children's needs came first in every equation that mattered. The life they'd built together was modest but secure, insulated from the kind of chaos and danger that existed in places like the Whitmore mansion, and Marcus had convinced himself that keeping his head down and his focus narrow was the best way to ensure that Emma's childhood would be different from his own traumatic early years. But tonight had shattered that illusion of safety, forcing him to confront the possibility that evil didn't respect the boundaries between neighborhoods, that staying silent in the face of injustice might protect his daughter from immediate danger while teaching her that good people looked the other way when bad things happened to strangers. The philosophical weight of that contradiction felt almost unbearable in the quiet of their small apartment. The clock on the cable box blinked 11:47 p.m. in red digits that seemed to pulse with urgency, each minute that passed feeling like another step away from the moment when he could have acted without thinking, when instinct might have overruled the careful calculations that came with having someone else's life depending on your choices. Marcus found himself thinking about the construction sites where he'd worked over the years, places where safety regulations existed because someone, somewhere, had learned that looking the other way when corners were cut inevitably led to preventable tragedies that destroyed more than just buildings. They destroyed families, communities, the trust that held society together. The missing person flyer seemed to glow in the lamplight, Jessica Chen's face a reminder that somewhere in the city, decisions were being made that would determine whether she came home alive, whether her parents would spend the rest of their lives wondering what they could have done differently, whether justice would prevail or money and power would once again write their own version of the truth. The parallel to his own situation was impossible to ignore. He was now the person who had seen something, knew something, and had to decide whether knowledge came with obligations that transcended personal comfort and safety. The refrigerator hummed in the kitchen, a domestic sound that usually provided a backdrop of normalcy to his late-night moments of reflection, but tonight it seemed to emphasize the gulf between his ordinary life and the extraordinary circumstances that had invaded it. Marcus thought about his grandmother's funeral, how the preacher had talked about the difference between knowledge and wisdom, between knowing what was right and having the courage to act on that knowledge even when the cost was higher than you wanted to pay. The congregation that day had been filled with people whose lives she'd touched through small acts of courage, speaking up when employers treated workers unfairly, reporting suspected abuse, even when it meant conflict with neighbors, providing shelter for women fleeing domestic violence even when it meant personal risk. Her legacy hadn't been built on grand gestures or public recognition, but on a lifetime of choosing difficult, right over easy wrong, and Marcus realized that he was facing the first test of whether those lessons had truly taken root in his character. The weight of that realization settled over him like a physical burden, heavier than any lumber he'd ever carried, more complex than any construction project he'd ever attempted to complete. Emma's soft murmur from the bedroom broke through his spiraling thoughts, probably the sound of her talking in her sleep, the way she sometimes did when processing the events of particularly exciting days. Marcus found himself moving toward her doorway again, drawn by the magnetic pull of parental devotion and the desperate need to reassure himself that she was safe, that whatever decisions he made in the coming days wouldn't ripple outward to destroy the one perfect relationship in his imperfect life. Her face was peaceful in the nightlight's glow, unmarked by the kind of worry lines that were already beginning to appear around his own eyes, and he realized that part of his paralysis came from wanting to preserve that innocence for as long as possible in a world that seemed determined to steal childhood from anyone vulnerable enough to trust in the basic goodness of adults. The stuffed elephant had shifted during her sleep, and Marcus gently adjusted it so she could reach for comfort if needed during the night, his calloused hands careful not to wake her, even as his heart ached with the knowledge that his next decisions might change everything about the security she took for granted. She deserved better than a father who brought danger home, but she also deserved better than a father who taught her through his actions that good people stayed silent when evil flourished in expensive houses behind iron gates. The apartment felt smaller somehow as Marcus returned to the living room, the walls closing in with the pressure of competing loyalties and impossible choices that seemed to have no clear resolution. He picked up Jessica Chen's missing person flyer again, studying her face for clues about who she had been before she disappeared, what dreams and hopes had been interrupted by whatever had happened during those late-night hours at the Whitmore Industries research facility. According to the brief description, she'd been a graduate student in environmental science, probably someone who believed that knowledge could be used to make the world better, to protect the planet for future generations of children like Emma, who deserved to inherit something more than the mistakes of their predecessors. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus that she might have died because she'd discovered something that powerful people wanted to keep hidden, that her commitment to truth and scientific integrity had made her a liability in someone else's profitable game of environmental destruction or cover-up. The connection between her work and whatever secret had Rebecca Whitmore so terrified was still unclear, but Marcus's construction experience had taught him to recognize the signs when foundational problems were spreading through a structure, small cracks that indicated much larger failures waiting to bring everything crashing down. The night stretched ahead like an endless corridor of sleepless hours, each minute bringing him closer to dawn and the decisions that daylight would demand from his conscience. Marcus knew that by morning he would need to choose between the safety of silence and the dangerous uncertainty of speaking truth to power, between protecting his daughter from immediate risk and teaching her through his actions that some fights were worth having even when victory seemed impossible. The missing person flyer lay between them like a bridge between his old life and whatever came next, Jessica Chen's face a silent plea for someone to care enough about justice to risk comfort and security for the possibility of bringing her home. Outside, Nashville slept peacefully, unaware that in one modest apartment, a single father was wrestling with the kind of moral choice that would define not just his own character, but the example he set for the daughter who trusted him to navigate the complex terrain between right and wrong, safety and courage, love and justice. The clock continued its relentless countdown toward morning, each tick echoing like a heartbeat in the silence, marking time until Marcus Thompson would have to decide what kind of man he truly was when everything he'd built depended on finding the strength to do what scared him most. In the quiet darkness of their small sanctuary, surrounded by the simple artifacts of their carefully constructed life together, Marcus found himself wondering if his grandmother had ever faced a moment like this, a crossroads where every path forward carried the potential for loss, where doing nothing felt like betrayal, and doing something felt like volunteering to destroy everything you'd worked to create. The answer came to him with the clarity of memory. She had faced such moments regularly, and she had consistently chosen the harder path because she believed that children were watching and learning from every adult decision about whether justice mattered more than convenience, whether other people's pain deserved attention, even when helping them came at personal cost. Now it was his turn to teach those lessons through his actions, to show Emma what kind of world they wanted to build together. And somewhere in the darkness of Nashville, Jessica Chen's fate hung in the balance of one ordinary man's extraordinary choice about whether love meant protecting your own family above all else, or whether it meant protecting all families by refusing to let evil flourish. A Starbucks on West End Avenue buzzed with afternoon energy. Soccer moms ordering lattes, students working on laptops, business people discussing mergers. The perfect camouflage for conversations that could expose decades of environmental terrorism or get everyone involved killed by elimination specialists who made corporate problems disappear permanently. Marcus arrived early, positioning himself where he could watch both entrances, his weathered hands wrapped around black coffee, while his eyes scanned for threats among the ordinary customers who had no idea they were sitting in the middle of a federal investigation that could reshape American environmental policy or end in systematic murder. Rebecca Whitmore entered like a woman approaching her own execution. Designer clothes couldn't hide the terror that had reduced her to desperate whispers 24 hours earlier. Her eyes darted constantly toward exits, the hypervigilance of someone who understood that her husband's resources included surveillance capabilities and contractors who specialized in making witnesses disappear. Dr. Mitchell was already at their corner table, laptop ready to document whatever revelations might emerge from this dangerous gamble. Her academic background had prepared her for research, not corporate assassination attempts, but months of watching students disappear had transformed her into something harder, more determined to see justice done regardless of personal cost. He killed them all. Rebecca's first words were barely audible, but they carried the weight of knowledge that had been eating at her conscience for months. Her voice shook with terror and relief, finally speaking truths that could expose environmental terrorism or seal her death warrant. "Harrison keeps detailed records of every elimination," she whispered, glancing around nervously. "Not for pleasure, for business efficiency. Each researcher, activist, or journalist who threatened our operations is catalogued with dates, methods, disposal procedures. The files read like a corporate directory of American environmental activism, except everyone listed is dead." Marcus felt his blood turn to ice. Jessica Chen wasn't missing. She was murdered, her body disposed of in abandoned mine shafts that Whitmore Industries used for illegal toxic waste disposal. Dr. Mitchell leaned forward, her laptop capturing every word. "Where are these files? Can you access them?" "I already have," Rebecca replied, pulling out a flash drive. "Financial records, elimination contracts, political bribes, everything." Harrison's organization chart for murder operations looks like a Fortune 500 company. Specialized departments for target identification, threat assessment, elimination planning, disposal services, and political protection. Former military contractors handle the actual killing, recruited through private security firms that specialize in corporate problem-solving. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. Dozens of co-conspirators in corporate boardrooms, government agencies, and contracting firms had systematically eliminated environmental researchers while corrupting the regulatory systems meant to protect public health. "The political corruption goes deeper than environmental crime," Rebecca continued. "Federal agencies, congressional offices, judicial chambers, all compromised through strategic donations and intimidation. Environmental protection laws exist mostly on paper. When investigators get too close to the truth, they're either reassigned, transferred, or eliminated through professional accidents." Marcus thought about Emma's science fair project on monarch butterflies, her innocent enthusiasm for learning about nature, while listening to documentation of systematic murder designed to protect corporate environmental destruction. The contrast felt like a moral test of everything his grandmother had taught him about standing up to bullies. Dr. Mitchell's fingers flew across her laptop keyboard, encrypting files for immediate transmission to FBI contacts who operated outside compromised official channels. This evidence could support federal conspiracy charges against dozens of co-conspirators. But we need to get you to protective custody before they're here. Rebecca's whispered warning cut through ambient coffee shop noise like a blade. Black sedans had pulled into the parking lot with professional precision. Customers who'd seemed like ordinary business people revealed themselves as surveillance specialists and elimination contractors, their positions carefully chosen to cover all exits while maintaining the appearance of coincidental presence. The coffee shop's casual atmosphere transformed into something predatory. Marcus felt his construction worker instincts kick in. The same situational awareness that kept him safe on job sites, now adapted to human predators instead of heavy machinery. "The files are already transmitted," Dr. Mitchell whispered, snapping her laptop shut. "FBI agents are en route, but we need to survive the next 10 minutes. Rebecca's purse contained a small pistol she clearly didn't know how to use, but her determination to avoid capture was evident in her white-knuckled grip. Marcus calculated exit routes with the precision he usually reserved for load-bearing requirements, while Dr. Mitchell clutched evidence that could expose decades of environmental terrorism if it reached honest investigators. The confrontation erupted with sudden violence. Corporate elimination specialists discovered that desperate people with nothing left to lose fought differently than isolated individuals they were accustomed to murdering quietly. Marcus's construction worker strength, Dr. Mitchell's fierce determination, and Rebecca's intimate knowledge of corporate procedures created unexpected resistance to professional killers. Coffee cups became weapons, cell phones turned into projectiles, and ordinary furniture transformed into barriers as the reality of corporate violence invaded customers' comfortable assumptions about public safety. Panicked civilians fled, providing cover for escape routes toward vehicles that could reach FBI investigators. Sirens approached, but Marcus understood that conventional law enforcement would be inadequate against corporate elimination teams with unlimited resources and political connections that could redirect official investigations toward convenient scapegoats. The escape felt like a compressed construction project, every decision carrying life or death consequences, while requiring attention to detail and safety protocols. Dr. Mitchell's car provided temporary sanctuary as all 3 survivors understood their safety was momentary at best. "There's no going back now," Rebecca said as they drove toward the FBI field office. "Harrison will mobilize every resource to eliminate us before this evidence reaches federal court." Marcus thought about Emma, probably practicing jokes for school recess, while her father risked everything for strangers' justice. But Jessica Chen had been someone's daughter too, and her parents deserved answers about what happened to their child, who'd only wanted to protect the planet's future. "My grandmother always said that love means protecting all families, not just your own," Marcus told them. "Emma deserves to grow up in a world where caring about the environment doesn't get you killed." The FBI field office loomed ahead like a fortress of hope and danger combined, either salvation through law enforcement protection or the beginning of a new phase in their war against corporate environmental terrorists who viewed murder as acceptable business practice. The missing person flyer in Marcus's pocket had become something sacred, a promise to Jessica Chen that her death wouldn't be meaningless if ordinary people found extraordinary courage to demand justice, regardless of personal cost. As they pulled into the federal building's parking garage, Marcus realized this was either the end of his normal life or the beginning of something that could protect children like Emma from inheriting a planet destroyed by corporations who murdered truth-tellers to protect quarterly profits. The weight of what lay ahead, testimony, trials, threats, felt almost unbearable. But looking at Rebecca's determined face and Dr. Mitchell's fierce resolve, Marcus understood that some battles were worth fighting even when victory seemed impossible. Emma would either grow up proud of a father who stood up for justice, or she'd inherit a world where environmental terrorists operated with impunity. There was no middle ground left. 6 months later, Marcus sat in the same Centennial Park where Dr. Mitchell had first approached him, but everything had changed. The federal courthouse downtown was bustling with reporters covering the final day of Harrison Whitmore III's trial, the biggest environmental terrorism prosecution in American history. 47 defendants, including corporate executives, government officials, and private contractors, faced charges ranging from conspiracy to commit murder to systematic environmental destruction that had poisoned communities across 3 states. Emma ran toward him from the playground, her butterfly project having won first place at the science fair, and evolved into a genuine passion for environmental protection. At 9 years old, she understood more about courage than most adults ever would, having watched her father testify against killers who viewed murder as acceptable business practice while maintaining the kind of quiet dignity that transformed ordinary men into heroes. "Did they find all of them, Daddy?" "And all of," she asked, settling beside him on the bench where he'd once wrestled with impossible choices between safety and justice. "Most of them, sweetheart. Jessica Chen and the other researchers are finally getting the justice they deserved." The FBI investigation had exceeded everyone's expectations. Rebecca Whitmore's evidence had unlocked a conspiracy that reached into dozens of corporations, regulatory agencies, and political offices where environmental protection had been systematically undermined through bribery, intimidation, and murder. The flash drive she'd risked her life to preserve contained not just Whitmore Industries records, but communications with a network of environmental terrorists who had operated with impunity for decades. Detective Linda Vasquez had been promoted to head the new Environmental Crimes Task Force. Her years of unofficial investigation finally vindicated through prosecutions that sent shockwaves through corporate boardrooms nationwide. The missing students weren't just missing anymore. They were murder victims whose deaths had meaning, whose research lived on through federal environmental regulations that bore their names and protected the communities they died trying to save. "What happened to the scary man?" Emma asked, referring to Harrison Whitmore in the simple terms that children used to categorize evil they couldn't fully comprehend. "He's going to prison for the rest of his life," Marcus replied, "and his company has to pay billions of dollars to clean up the water they poisoned and help the families they hurt." The sentence had been everything Dr. Mitchell and the other advocates had hoped for: life without parole for Harrison Whitmore III, plus financial penalties that would fund environmental cleanup efforts for generations. Whitmore Industries had been dismantled, its assets liquidated to compensate victims and restore damaged ecosystems that had been treated as dumping grounds for toxic waste. Rebecca Whitmore had survived the trials, though not unchanged. The Witness Protection Program had given her a new identity in Oregon, where she worked with environmental advocacy groups that helped other corporate whistleblowers find the courage to expose crimes they'd witnessed. Her testimony had been devastating: hours of detailed revelations about systematic murder disguised as business decisions, delivered with the quiet authority of someone who'd found redemption through truth-telling despite personal cost. Marcus's own testimony had lasted 3 days, his construction workers' attention to detail providing crucial corroboration for Rebecca's evidence. The defense attorneys had tried to portray him as an opportunistic interloper seeking attention and financial reward, but his obvious discomfort with publicity and consistent refusal to accept monetary compensation had convinced jurors that his motivations were purely moral: a single father who'd accidentally witnessed evil and found the courage to challenge it despite personal danger. "Are you sad about our old house?" Emma asked, referring to the apartment they'd left behind when FBI protection required relocation to a safer neighborhood across town. "A little," Marcus admitted. "But home isn't really about the building, is it? It's about the people you love and the choices you make to protect what matters most." The new apartment was larger and in a better school district, funded by the reward money that Marcus had finally accepted on Emma's behalf, college tuition secured by her father's moral courage. But more importantly, it was in a community where environmental protection was taken seriously, where children like Emma could pursue scientific education without fear of retaliation from corporate interests that viewed knowledge as a threat to profitable operations. Dr. Mitchell had been awarded tenure and a research chair at Vanderbilt, her unofficial investigation of missing environmental researchers now officially recognized as groundbreaking work that had exposed systematic murder while advancing environmental justice. The Sarah Mitchell Center for Environmental Advocacy bore Jessica Chen's name as its first memorial research fellowship, ensuring that future graduate students could pursue environmental protection with institutional support and federal protection from corporate retaliation. The ripple effects of the case extended far beyond Nashville. Environmental research programs across the country had been strengthened with new funding and security protocols that protected researchers from corporate intimidation. Federal environmental agencies had been restructured to prevent the kind of regulatory capture that had allowed decades of environmental terrorism to operate with impunity. Most importantly, a new generation of environmental scientists was emerging, young people like Emma who understood that protecting the planet sometimes required personal courage, but was always worth the fight. "Daddy, Mrs. Patterson wants to know if you'll speak at our school about being brave," Emma said, referring to her teacher who'd been following the case with the kind of civic engagement that democracy required from educated citizens. "What would I tell them?" Marcus asked, genuinely uncertain about what lessons his experience offered to children who might face their own moral dilemmas someday. "That being scared doesn't mean you can't do what's right. That ordinary people can make extraordinary differences when they choose courage over comfort. That love means protecting not just your own family, but all families who deserve to live without fear of corporate violence and environmental destruction." Her words carried the wisdom of someone who'd watched her father wrestle with impossible choices and emerge changed but intact, stronger for having discovered that conscience was more powerful than fear when backed by community support and institutional protection. Emma understood that heroes weren't born. They were made through decisions that prioritized moral courage over personal safety, truth over convenience, justice over comfort. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the park, Marcus thought about Jessica Chen and the other researchers whose deaths had catalyzed changes that would protect future generations of environmental scientists and activists. Their sacrifice hadn't been meaningless. It had exposed a system of corporate environmental terrorism that most Americans never knew existed, leading to prosecutions and reforms that would prevent similar tragedies for decades to come. The missing person flyer that had started this journey was now framed in their living room, not as a monument to tragedy, but as a reminder of what was possible when ordinary citizens refused to accept that evil could operate with impunity simply because it wore expensive suits and commanded vast financial resources. Jessica's smiling face served as inspiration for Emma's own environmental activism, a bridge between one generation's sacrifice and another's determination to build a more just and sustainable world. "Will there be more bad people who try to hurt the environment?" Emma asked with the directness that children brought to complex questions that adults often avoided through euphemism and evasion. "Probably," Marcus replied honestly. "But there will also be more good people willing to stand up to them. That's how we make sure the bad people don't win, by refusing to stay silent when we witness injustice, even when speaking up feels scary or dangerous." The park around them continued its peaceful afternoon routine, but Marcus now understood that peace wasn't the absence of conflict. It was the presence of justice, maintained through the constant vigilance of citizens who refused to let evil flourish while good people remained silent. Children played on swings while their parents discussed school schedules and weekend plans, their casual conversations possible because people like Rebecca Whitmore had found the courage to expose systematic murder, and people like Marcus had risked everything to ensure that truth reached federal investigators who could transform evidence into justice. As they walked home together, Emma's small hand in his weathered one, Marcus realized that his grandmother's lessons about standing up to bullies had prepared him for exactly the kind of moral test that defined character and shaped the world that children would inherit from adults who either found the courage to fight for what was right or chose comfortable silence while innocence suffered. The choice hadn't been easy, but it had been clear. Love meant protecting all children, not just your own, and justice required personal sacrifice from anyone who accidentally stumbled across evidence of systematic evil operating with impunity in America's most exclusive neighborhoods and corporate boardrooms. The evening stretched ahead with homework questions and bedtime stories, normal domestic routines that felt precious because they were possible in a world where environmental terrorists could no longer murder researchers with impunity, where children like Emma could pursue scientific education without fear of retaliation, where ordinary people had proved that extraordinary courage could triumph. Their overwhelming power when backed by community support and institutional protection. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that ordinary people can make extraordinary differences when they choose courage over comfort. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is refuse to stay silent when we witness injustice, even when speaking up feels impossible. Your voice matters, your courage matters, and sometimes one person's decision to do what's right can protect countless others who don't even know they need protecting yet.